Hello everyone, welcome to my studio. Today I'd like to show you how to compose and paint some icebergs floating in the bay in Alaska. As you could see from the reference photo, the icebergs were far to the right and not very well placed, and so I moved them, I floated them visually towards the center of the painting and closer to the front. When I was in Alaska on a cruise, I saw lots of these icebergs, and I remember the first one I saw, I just couldn't believe how blue the ice was. And I just love painting them. And they really do appear to glow. And so I'm going to show you how to get that glow in your painting. So I'm starting with cerulean blue phthalo, and while cerulean blue phthalo is still wet on the paper, I'm going back over it just at the bottom with cobalt blue. I'm allowing the paint to just flow around and mix on the paper while it's still wet, and I'm also being careful to leave little white spaces. This helps it look like it's glowing. Another thing that was amazing about Alaska was when you looked up into the mountains in the distance, you could see the glowing turquoise blue of the glaciers up there too. So I took a little of that cerulean blue and I put it up on the mountain in the background. If you look closely at the reference photo, you'll also see that the icebergs are reflecting into the water. And so very, very lightly, so that means I used a lot of water with the paint, I've added cobalt blue underneath the icebergs to show the reflection. I did this now because when I come back and paint the other water around the icebergs, I want to make sure that I paint around the reflections. So it's important to put those first because it's too easy to paint over it later and then you can't get that pretty reflective color. I'm painting the sky with cerulean blue phthalo just by itself in lots of water, just making kind of a nice light washy sky. Remember that the sky is always the lightest color shape in your painting, the lightest overall color shape. So it needs to be lighter than the second lightest color shape, which is always whatever is flat or horizontal and reflective. In this case, that would be the water surrounding the glaciers. I'm painting the mountains around the lake or around the bay with a variety of different colors. So I'm starting with Hooker's green, and I applied that by itself, and then over the Hooker's green I put a few strokes of yellow ochre, and I just let those colors mix around a little bit. I mixed quinacridone purple bluish with burnt sienna for that dark brown color. And now I'm going over it with a little more quinacridone purple bluish and also some ultramarine to further deepen the color and just show some texture and depth in this mountain. I want to make each one of the mountain shapes slightly different. The one on the right is very, very dark, so I've mixed Hooker's green and ultramarine blue, and I'm going to come back in with some other colors too to give it variety or color variety within the shape. So when you layer colors and you let the colors mix on the paper, you don't always have to put the lightest color down first. You can put a dark color down and let the colors mix around, and you can put a light color over the dark color. A lot of people think you only have to paint from light to dark in watercolor, but that's not true. I'm taking a little of that dark and I'm putting it on this mountain shape in the distance as well. I'm using ultramarine blue and a tiny bit of quinacridone rose for the bluish mountain. That's the next layer back behind the bay. I've chosen this color specifically because the bay is going to have a lot of green in it, a lot of green in the water. So I wanted to make sure that I had some bluish purple mountains in the background, and that sort of fits with the reference photo. But if you look at it, there are also a lot of green trees, and if you've ever been to Alaska, one of the things you'll notice is just the vastness of the forest. And there's a lot of ice and snow in the mountains, but there's also a lot of green, and it's a deep, rich green of these spruce trees or pine trees. Not really sure what they are, but they're very green, and it's very lush in the summer. So I wanted to make sure that even though I had that violet color for the purplish mountains in the distance, that I also added some greenery. It needs to have both to look authentically like Alaska. Notice how, once again, I'm letting the colors mix around while they're wet and they're mixing right onto the paper. This is Hooker's Green again, and I'm being careful to leave the space where the glacier flows down into the water. You see that little white space in between the two mountains. I've added a little bit of cadmium yellow lemon and azo yellow deep to that green at the top of that mountain. I wanted to have that one glow a little bit. Again, I want to have variety and a little bit of different color shapes for each of the mountains. I'm carefully painting around where the glaciers are in the mountains and leaving a little bit of white where the glacier meets the greenery. I have a white space in between. The one at the very back is the one that's most in silhouette with the sky. And when something is in silhouette, in other words, it has light behind it, it loses a lot of its color. So I've made it sort of a gray, and I've made it quite dark against the sky. I made this color with ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and quinacridone purple bluish. And I'm just emphasizing the dark at the top because I really wanted to stand out against the light colored sky. So wherever the mountains are up in silhouette closest to the sky, they need to be darker. Later I'm also going to darken the bottom of the mountains where they meet the water. So the mountain shape on the left has a lot of greenery. You can sort of see the trees coming out of the rocks, and I'm painting that greenery with Hooker's Green, and while it's still wet, I'm going to drop in some yellows. It's sort of like dropping in sunshine on the top of the dark green. So I'm dropping the yellow in at the top, but some of it's going to run down and mix into the other parts of the green as well. And then later when it dries, I'll go back and darken the bottom parts of each of those green shapes. I've mixed burnt sienna and a tiny bit of yellow ochre to make this reddish brown color for the rocks that surround the shapes of green trees. It's a nice way to make this mountain shape much different in color from the others. So I talked about the water having a lot of green in it. This is one of the things that you can do to help the icebergs look like they're glowing. If you painted the water the same color as the icebergs, then they wouldn't stand out. And it does have a lot of green in it. I'm not sure what the green comes from, but it's slightly murky too. Maybe there's a lot of silt in the water, I'm not sure. I made this color using cerulean blue phthalo plus Hooker's Green and also a little bit of cobalt blue. Then I added a little bit of yellow ochre to it, so I mixed quite a few colors to get this hue. But what you want to come out with when you mix the colors is a color that's greenish blue. So not too green. It doesn't need to be green like the greenery on the mountains, but it also needs to be a green that's nothing like the blue in the icebergs. So it needs to really separate from them. They need to be a blue that goes more towards violet, although they have some cerulean blue in them as well. So it has to be a color that's very different from just cerulean blue by itself. Whatever colors you're using to mix, just take your time mixing that color because it's definitely an integral part of this composition and really important to getting the glaciers to look like they're glowing. That plus the reflection of the glaciers in the water really gives them that glow. So I'm coming down around the glaciers, and you'll notice that I'm leaving some little white halo spots around where the tops of the glaciers are in front of the water. This gives them a little sparkle. As I'm coming towards the front of the painting, I've made the color slightly more bluish, not quite as green, and then I'm going to add some deeper green down in the very front. But I'm carefully going around the glaciers, and I've gone up in between some of where the reflection is, and I've added some of that teal color in between the violet blue reflections. Where the teal color comes in between the violet reflections, I've left a little white space as well. You need to have some vertical white spaces saved to add to that, to add to the reflection. Notice how I'm carefully making some of my brush strokes horizontal and others vertical. I definitely want vertical strokes underneath the icebergs and in between the violet reflections. I'm blending a little bit because I want the edges to look soft and I don't want my painting to look too streaky. I will add some streaks of other blues for texture later on. So at this point, looking at my painting, it looks very flat. Everything looks sort of mid-tone. And so what I need to do now is increase the contrast. And at the base of the mountain cliffs that are towards the front of the painting, there's a very dark edge. And it's dark, I suppose, because it's wet. So to make this dark, I mixed burnt sienna, quinacridone purple bluish, and ultramarine blue. And I know I've repeated that color mixture so many times, but it's a really good one for making colorful darks, because adding burnt sienna allows you to make it a slightly opaque and earthy looking, which fits with landscapes, and slightly more reddish. And then having the ultramarine blue allows you to make the dark more bluish, and the violet sort of tones everything and makes it look more natural. So it's a really good color mixture to memorize for making deep, rich darks that are colorful. So I'm just making some vertical strokes over the burnt sienna yellow ochre mixture that's dry, just to give some of that rocky texture to that cliff. And I'm going back into the dark green tree spaces and adding a little dark shadowing underneath each of those tree spaces to show, or tree shapes, to show that they're coming out of the rocks or growing out of the rocks. I'm also adding some contrast to the icebergs. I'm using ultramarine blue and a very small amount of quinacridone purple bluish, just to give a little bit of a dark base to them where they meet the water. I'm also adding dark to the bottom of the mountains in the distance. I'm using the same color mixture that I mixed before with burnt sienna, quinacridone purple bluish, and ultramarine blue. The mixture in the background is slightly more violet in tone than the one that's on this rock here, which has a little more burnt sienna in it. Soften the edge a little bit with water. Soft edges visually represent something that's wet or three-dimensional, and I want this to be a wet looking edge. I want the edge also to be softened because it's toward the left side of the paper. The same thing for the one on the right. I want to have more contrast in the center and around the icebergs, and I want those cliffs to just sort of frame the whole scene, visually frame it. Just adding a tiny bit more blue to the bottom of the icebergs, and I'm softening that edge as well. So I'm using cobalt blue and just some water. Now it's time to add some texture to the bay. So I'm using a mixture of cobalt blue and cerulean blue. And I just want to add a few marks for texture and movement, and to just show that water's moving around in the bay. It's tranquil enough to have reflections, but there's definitely some lines from wind or currents or something like that. And I'm making some delicate lines right through the reflections, which are dry now. So I'm making horizontal lines with just the point of my brush right across the vertical lines. This really enhances the reflection, and it picks up the color of the icebergs, and it just harmonizes it with the water. I'm adding a little definition to the glaciers in the distant mountain, and a little bit of dark to that point, that peak in the background. This cliff on the left, I felt it needed a little more warmth, so I just glazed a little bit of burnt sienna over it. Glazing means you lightly brush a color over dry paint without disturbing it too much. I'm adding some more texture to the bay in the distance. I felt like it needed some dark lines, and so I used ultramarine blue and cerulean blue and also a little bit of hooker's green. I wanted it to be a deep, rich, greenish blue for the background. When you're making these kind of details in your painting, take your time. It's very easy to overdo these lines, and all of a sudden your painting looks too busy and streaky, and you'll take away from the tranquility of the scene. Just do them little by little, and take your time and stand back from your painting and just sort of assess if you put enough lines, if you need more, and then just put one or two more, and then just take your time looking at it and really deciding if you've put enough of them in. I added a little more warm green and a darker green to the left side of that bluish iceberg, and I'm also going to add a couple of strokes of that to the foreground. I used ultramarine blue and hooker's green plus a tiny bit of yellow ochre to warm it. It just seemed to be the nicest finishing touch I could think of for the front of the painting. I think having the warm green around the cool blue of the icebergs is what makes the icebergs glow. That plus leaving little white spaces. One final dark accent at the back and we're finished. I hope you enjoyed this painting of the floating icebergs in beautiful Alaska.